This is the Politics of Everything, and I'm your host, Amber Daines. Welcome to the podcast where we want to discuss the politics of everything, from money to motherhood, nutrition to narcissism, startups to secularism, the environment to equality, and much more. Our guests are experts in their field or topic of choice, even if you've not yet heard their name. This is a bipartisan podcast, so while we love exploring varied views and get a buzz from a healthy debate, by no means is this a one-sided forum for any one political view. So please listen up and enjoy the politics of everything. Get ready to laugh, cringe and be challenged in this podcast episode. I'm chatting today to Marty Wilson, a former Australian Comic of the Year whose multifaceted career has stretched him to become a TED speaker, best-selling author, awarded copywriter, media commentator and popular business speaker, as well as an in-demand MC. His core message is on using humour to build resilience with his programs instantly relatable for different audiences. So here we go, Marty. I'm strapped in and ready to ride the roller coaster of the politics of humour. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Wow, what an intro. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm exhausted listening to all those things that you've done and you do.
I'm an inveterate dabbler, jack of all trades, master of none.
Fair enough. So let's dive straight in. You're not always going to be a stand-up comic. I mean, you don't get born into life thinking, I'm going to be a stand-up comic one day. But I guess for you, you started your career quite differently. You were a pharmacist and then went into comedy. How did that happen?
I got dared into it. I was dared into doing stand-up comedy. It was when I had a bit of a dabble between pharmacy and stand-up as a copywriter. And it was back in the 90s and was all, Apple Macs and ponytails. And we were having this big, once a month we'd have these big goal sessions round a table. And I just happened to mention that I wouldn't mind giving stand-up a go one day. And then this typographer, it was a big open plan office, this typographer down the other end of the room piped up in front of the whole, there's about 20 people in the office at the time, and said, I got handed this flyer at Central Station about stand-up comedy tryouts tonight at the Harold Park Hotel. And it was one of those scenes, I forget what the proper word for the focus technique is in movies where, like, the camera just zooms in on the protagonist's face and all the background goes, and it's I guess I'm trying stand-up then.
Wow. So you must have had some material, though. You don't just sort of get up and hope it works out, surely.
No. I actually ended up doing, I enrolled in, there was a course attached to it where we enrolled. There was about 10 of us who we sort of workshop material in front of each other for about 3 or 4 weeks. And then we took over the open mic of the Harold Park Hotel. And that was they used to call that the Virgin Sacrifice. They used to call that at the Harold Park Hotel. I was the first ever graduate group of the Virgin Sacrifice. And, some other, great comics like Ando was a graduate of a later version of the course, and a few other people whose names escape me. So it was one of those, intense, but friendly ways to try out a bit of material first. And then, so we got up, and then they asked me back the second week, and then the third week they paid me. And then it was like, hang on 1 second. Hang on a minute.
This could be a career.
Yeah. And so I ended up, to be honest, like I'd always loved humour. Like I remember really clearly this time when I was a little kid, and I must have been like year 5, year 6, and I was off school sick, and sleeping in the lounge room, one of those sort of fold out mattress beds sort of things that were big in the 70s and 80s. And I remember, like, Mum had to go out, and so I was home alone, and I was just desperately ill and desperately lonely. And I remember thinking that I can't wait until 6 o'clock comes around, because the whole family would sit down in front of the goodies on ABC and all laugh together. And I just desperately missed that feeling that we all get when we all laugh at the same thing together. That lovely, lovely feeling that everybody's pretense, everybody's baggage drops away when you can get a whole room full of people laughing together. And I just desperately had missed that, and just had this deep understanding of the power of that, even when I was a kid. So, like, I was always like the idiot getting up at assemblies and doing sketches, making fun of the headmaster, and then doing 18th birthday and 21st birthday speeches and emceeing friends' weddings and things like that. So it had been something I'd always really enjoyed doing. My dad, when I was doing stand-up, my dad used to say he'd tell his friends, well, it's the best job in the world for anyone genetically predisposed to be the class dickhead.
So I guess it sounds like you left pharmacy behind pretty quickly then, and you pursued that road less travelled, I guess, of comedy. Where did that take you? Like globally, did you travel? What sort of lifestyle does a stand-up comic have?
When it was just myself and my then girlfriend, now wife, it was just the best fun in the world. I travelled. I went over to the UK in 1999, following the Wallabies around for the Rugby World Cup, and it was it was back then, the Aussie dollar bought 32 pence, not sort of 57 or 60 like it does now. And so I did I'd only been doing it for about a year and a half in Australia, and I had won this Australian Comic of the Year thing. And so I did a few gigs over in the UK just to help pay for my trip, just to try and earn some pounds sterling. And it was one of those lovely stories where an agent over there saw me and said, I can have your diary full. When are you going to move here? So I dragged my then girlfriend, now wife, she's English, kicking and screaming back to the UK. She'd just been sponsored out here in Australia. And I dragged her back to the UK with the idea of, like being like the Beatles went to Germany for 2 years and did their 10,000 hours and came back. I ended up sitting on a plane next to Jimmy Barnes one day on the way out to Dubbo, doing a comedy gig out in Dubbo, and I was having a chat to Barnesy about it, and he said that before Down Under, the song Down Under took off for Men at Work, he said Men at Work were supporting us. And then the song took off and we were supporting them. And they didn't have enough material to be a headline act yet. And so I was talking to him and he said, find wherever in the world has the biggest and best stand-up comedy scene and just go there for a couple of years. And so I actually followed Barnesy's advice and moved to the UK, and it was meant to take me there just for a couple of years, and I ended up staying for 8. And the great thing is when you're in the UK, you're flown anywhere around the world where there's a big enough band of British expats, and you get to do comedy shows all around the world. So I was all through Asia and the Middle East and that sort of, anywhere there was a big bunch of British expats. So it was a wonderful time. And then we started having kids, and I realised that because my wife was a nurse, and so she could just take Sunday, Monday off, and that was our weekend. But then once we started having kids, my wife pretty much had to fit into society, just with preschools and things like that, and I couldn't. And that was when I decided that I wanted to give stand-up away and start writing books and being a speaker like I am now.
Interesting. So I guess what ingredients do you think make stand-up comedy work? I mean, there's probably many things, but are there any sort of tried and true things that you think make it work really well? And I guess where do most people go wrong?
Sure. I think most people go wrong exactly the same way that I went wrong for about the first 6 to 12 months. I had this idea in my head. One of the comics that I loved was a guy called Bill Hicks, who he ended up starting stand-up when he was about 10, sneaking into comedy clubs and getting on stage. But his style, he was very much a social commentator, a political commentator, and very much of there are a lot of stand-up comics who get up on stage and finger point at people in the audience or groups within society. Like, these guys are dickheads. You're a dickhead. These guys are dickheads. This group of people are idiots. Like, am I the only person that can see how big of idiots these people are? That sort of thing. And I tried to be that sort of comedian when I first started. But it wasn't until I realized that the stuff that I like the best and the people that really resonated with me were the people, instead of standing up there and pointing at the audience saying, you're all dickheads, it's people who put the audience in a big cuddle and say, aren't we all dickheads? And be a butt of the joke as well, and stop trying to be angrily ranting at the audience, because it's just not me. And so, getting back to your question, I think that's what most people try to do. They look up some jokes on the internet and try and do those, or they sort of try and be somebody they're not. Rather than when I teach people to use humour in their presentations and things like that, I say, ask your friends, ask your partner, ask your wife, ask your husband, what are the top 3 or 4 stories that I tell socially, and tell again, those stories we all know, like we're at a dinner party or a barbecue. If the funny stories are coming out, we know that our partner's going to tell the when I was 12 at school, or, that story they tell again and again and again.
Exactly.
And so get those stories that are really you and really come from your sense of humor, because you'll tell those really well. So instead of trying to, shoehorn other people's material into your content or your speaking or your presentations, just let it come from within you, and then you'll deliver it far better, and you'll deliver it with confidence, and then the audience will buy into it.
Interesting. So even though I say you've left pharmacy behind, your credentials in that field have come to the fore a little bit. You say that you use proven scientific data to craft some of your laugh out loud stories and I guess coach others. Why is science the key to making us laugh?
Well, I think because humour has proven to be such a powerful thing in communications, and and business and life and our dealings with people is all about communications. There's lots of scientific data out there about what's funnier than and what's funny and what's not. For example, it has been proven that explosive sounds like K sounds and P sounds and B sounds are funnier than words that don't have those things in them. So if you're looking like, Timbuktu Tech is funnier than Sydney University. A chicken and pickle toasty is funnier than a ham roll. And they've done jokes, but they've done experiments where they use that type of thing in different punchlines, and they get people to rate them. They get 1,000 people to rate them because, humor isn't funny until people laugh at it. But there's people out there who've done experiments and to find out exactly what we really laugh at. So if you can educate yourself, like there's a guy called Professor Peter McGraw who's done a book on it. There's a book called just called Ha! By Weems is the guy's last name. There's lots of books out there and YouTube clips of people talking about the scientific data that lets you educate yourself into how to be funnier. So, why not? Why not dive into that?
That's interesting. So I guess for you, you've obviously done this for such a long time now, and you've spoken to over 500,000 people since that first stage performance over 20 years ago. How did you sort of transition from being stand-up comic to the lifestyle you now lead as a business speaker, an author, an MC? And I guess what did that teach you to actually change tack in your career?
When I came back from being in the UK, I was over there for 8 years, and I found my comedy diary on a spreadsheet, and I realised that my average was 4.5 gigs a week for 8 years when I was over there. So that's a lot of gigs, and so I was a bit over the stage time when I came back. So I tried to just run away and be an author for a while, just because I'd always wanted to write books. I'd always had an enthusiasm for writing from my advertising days, and just even when I was a kid, having short stories published in the school magazine and all that sort of thing. And so I did that for a while, but so I guess I considered myself an author who spoke when someone asked him to, rather than a speaker as such. But I think people started to hear that I was pretty funny, and started getting asked to do more and more keynotes at conferences and things like that. And eventually, I'm drawing a graph in the air, and if you imagine one line going down and one line coming up, and then eventually the balance between speaking and authoring shifted, and I've written 12 books in this What I Wish I Knew series out there, and although I really enjoyed doing them, I'm not sure I'll do any more, just because I end up, last year I did just over 100 speaking gigs, and I'm actually back really enjoying it more, which I think is, the most important thing, because when you're doing something that you really enjoy, that you end up doing it a lot better. And so I guess in terms of what did the process teach me, I think you have to let yourself be guided by, I love that saying, bring your great love to the world's great need. Like, you can't give the world everything it needs. The world needs everything. So you really have to, in some way, ask yourself, what part of me do I really want to give the world? And for me, it is that performing thing. I think it really gives me a massive high. And when I'm up there doing it, the one thing I really love about doing speaking, as opposed to doing stand-up, for example, when you're doing stand-up, you've really got to hit the audience with a punchline every 17 seconds, or they just throw chicken wings at you. It ends up, the contract is very pure. when you're doing stand-up. Whereas when you're doing speaking, I talk if I speak for an hour, I talk about resilience and change is one of the subjects I speak about, and that I talk for about 3 or 4 minutes about the process that my wife and I went through when my wife has, and she doesn't mind me talking about this, had what she describes as an ongoing dance with depression and anxiety all her life. She had 3 episodes of crippling postnatal depression after each of our kids, to the point where about 9 months after the birth of our youngest child, Charlie, I came home and over the dinner table, Ali burst into tears and slid across the table to me the goodbye letters that she'd written to myself and all 3 of our boys individually. And
wow, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, but that's. And in my talk about my What I Wish I Knew books, because I use because I've done over 1,000 interviews for this What I Wish I Knew series now, and so the themes that keep coming up when you ask people if you could go back and give your younger self one bit of advice, what would it be? That those themes make up my resilience talk. And it was actually that moment when Ali showed me the goodbye letters that led me to contact the Black Dog Institute and do a What I Wish I Knew about depression. So it was that really heartbreaking moment and I can go in and talk about that for 3 or 4 minutes when I'm doing a keynote at a corporate conference or, one of my public events or something like that. Whereas in stand-up, you couldn't really do that. You might be able to get away with that, or sort of like an Edinburgh show or a Melbourne show or something like that, as long as you had a really funny story straight after it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so I think in terms of what that process taught me, getting back to your original question after rambling for quite a bit, it's about that you have, because when I started doing stand-up, I thought, this is it, this is me for life. But you have to be open to that evolving in even further than that. When you think this is it for the rest of your life, I think I had to be open to the idea that, because I get, 8.5 out of 10 a buzz out of doing keynote speaking as I do out of stand-up. Like, stand-up's a real thrill, but I get 20 times the gratification from doing speaking than I did from stand-up. Stand-up was sort of one of those, okay, the gig's over, I never see those people again, I never hear from those people again. It's probably once a year you'd get someone come up to you and say, look, I'm going through a really tough time. Tonight was really great for me, thank you. Whereas in speaking, you get that almost every gig, because you get to hang around with people afterwards and maybe go to the drinks after the event. And it's just a really, really lovely, gratifying, valuable way to make a contribution to the world. I absolutely adore it.
I can feel that passion and energy, which even when you talk about it. And I know you touched briefly on the idea of resilience in that last answer, but it is a term that we hear a lot these days in the Western world in terms of raising resilient kids or handling failure as an adult or whatever it might be. So how is it linked to comedy? And when you teach others in your presentations and programs, what is the core message around resilience that you're trying to impart?
Sure. I mean, I guess if anyone wants to get into this more deeply, I've got a TED talk out there called Take Funny Seriously, where I explain it in a lot more detail if what I say next talks to you. But the basic synopsis of it is that research has shown, and again, there's been so much research into how our brains work, the psychology of the human condition over the last 20 or 30 years has shown that if you deliberately choose to laugh at your stressors, if you deliberately choose to laugh at the things that are stressing you, upsetting you, making you angry, all those things that we class as, I'm making quotation marks in the air, negative emotions, it helps you, if you laugh at those things, it helps you reappraise threats and reduce stress. I can send you through the links to these studies if you want to put them up in your show notes at the end.
Definitely.
And so it's like if you choose to laugh at something, it's like it flicks a switch in the back of your head that says, well, I must be bigger than that. I must be in control of that if I can choose to laugh at it. And that increases your personal resilience. It facilitates psychological well-being. And it's been shown, a great study by Can and Collette that came out in 2014 has been shown to give you greater positive affect, which is a psychological term just for cheerful and more happier. and who doesn't want that, So just deliberately choosing to laugh at things that are driving you nuts. And because, part of humor is, looking at things in more than one way. And so, quite often lot of humour involves you think a story is going along this way and all of a sudden there's a jump in your mind and you realise that what was actually being said is something different. And so if you can deliberately choose to look at the things that are stressing you in 3, 4, 5, 10 different ways, then that's been shown to reduce stress and help you reappraise the things that are driving you nuts.
That's totally interesting. And I love that perspective that you give, that you laugh at things that, maybe are driving you nuts. Because I think our instant reaction, well, mine personally, I can't speak for everybody, obviously, is, oh my goodness, I'm just going to rant. I'm going to be angry. I'm going to be resentful. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't make you feel any better. It doesn't actually solve the problem. So It's an interesting way to kind of turn it on its head, if you like.
Yeah, there used to be a psychological school of thought that it was cathartic for you to rant about things like that, but they've shown more recent studies have shown that isn't actually the case, and it's actually not good for you to go ranting and screaming about things that are upsetting you.
So back to your comedy piece. Mm-hmm. Do you have a fail-proof comedy story which we will probably all laugh at, and one that you think that even make the sternest-looking British Tory guy laugh?
All right. Yeah, okay. Let me cue up a sound effect because the punchline to it is a sound effect. Hang on a sec. All right, there we go. For those of you, for the listeners, if you have kids, for those of you who are listening who have kids, like when I say this in an audience, I say, who's got kids? Put your hand up. And I say, leave your hand up if when you had your first child, you had a birthing plan. Did you have kids, Amber?
Oh, yes, I've got two. I think I had a birthing plan for the first one. The second one I knew better.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I say. I say, leave your hand up if your birth went exactly like your birthing plan. And they never do. They never do. And so my wife's an accident emergency nurse, and so her birthing plan was no doctors, don't any doctors, no medical intervention. And so we were booked into the midwife-led unit, which is next to the hospital, but not part of the hospital.
DIY birth, if you like.
Yeah. It was, we were booked into, the big spa pool where you give birth in there, and there were dream catchers up on the wall. She'd been doing the meditation for birthing. There were, like electric candles so the gas wouldn't explode or something like that. And we get to the hospital, and sadly, after 15 minutes, we were like undiagnosed breech baby. So the baby's the right way up instead of upside down. And so, we think we're going over here to the midwife-led unit with the soft dream catchery in the spa pool. 45 minutes we get to the hospital, because we've turned up with like enough food to last 3 days and enough Enya to last a week, because my wife just loves Enya, and I just fucking hate Enya, but it's totally her show. So absolutely bring those 37 Enya CDs, my darling. So we think we're going to the birthing pool. We're 45 minutes later. My wife is numb from the chest down. We're in the operating theatre, and the surgeon's about to open her up and do an emergency Caesar. Now, I think the anaesthetist could tell that my wife was quite upset by this. So he leans down and whispers into her ear and says, "Oh, Mrs. Wilson, would you like me to turn the radio on? Would you like some music during the procedure, like during the operation?" And my wife just looks up at me with this earnest, angelic look in her eyes and just said, "Wouldn't it be a sign if Enya came on the radio?" And like, I'm not an idiot, so I'm just like, "Yes, darling, it would." And this song, at this point in the song, is what came out of the stereo. I'll play it and hope it comes down the line to you.
Oh no.
And my wife was just shaking with laughter, and it was just the perfect metaphor for what life is really like, because in that moment, we could have exploded into anger, we could have dissolved into tears, but our eyes locked, and we just chose to laugh. And all the tension in that room about the birth not going the way it should have, the clinical atmosphere in the operating room, all that tension was dispersed, and we got on with the idea of, look, we're not getting our beautiful firstborn child the way we thought we were going to, but we're still getting our beautiful firstborn child.
What a great story. I guess I'm a big believer that many people have mentors or inspirational people that have guided them along the way, not always in the same industry, but they can be. Do you have any, and what have they taught you about success and I guess the business path you've travelled?
I guess the way I would answer that question is doing the interviews for this What I Wish I Knew series. I've interviewed over 1,000 amazing people, and some of whose stories we know, like Ando, the Vietnamese comic, Naomi Simpson from Shark Tank, Wayne Bennett, the footy coach, like Julia Morris out in the jungle with the celeb, Maggie Beer, AFL legend, Mark Rasciuto, John Eales, like all these people whose stories we know, but mostly it's just been people like you and I who've been through extraordinary things. Like I've interviewed depression survivors, I've interviewed cancer survivors, I've interviewed World War II survivors, I've interviewed 9/11 survivors, I've interviewed like a Buddhist nun who works with prisoners on death row in Los Angeles. I've interviewed celebrity comedians the world over. And so I wouldn't say I've had key mentors. It's more the sheer weight of mentorship that I've got from interviewing that many people and asking them, how to do life well, how to get to the end of your days. And the way I describe it in my keynote is like how to get to the end of your days and be sitting on a park bench, arm in arm with someone you adore, looking back on your life with a big satisfied smile instead of a heart full of regrets. And the sheer weight of advice that I've got from those people has just been absolutely extraordinary for me and been a constant. Some people say like a particular bit of advice gave them a big springboard into the future or something like that. I would say I've been very lucky through writing these books that I've just been given constant course adjustments in my business, in my personal life, in my fatherhood, in my relationship with my wife. I've very luckily had lots and lots of people giving me lots of wonderful advice. And so if there's one way I could wrap that up about people is wrap that up for your listeners, it might sound simplistic, it might sound trite, but just talk to people. I do a lot of these corporate conferences and that sort of thing, and you hear people talking in the bars afterwards after they've had a full day's conference, and you hear, oh, mate, how business going? Oh, kicking girls with both feet, big fella. Don't you worry about that, sunshine. Like all these bullshit, fake surface-level conversations, whereas I say to them, when I'm up on stage, like, don't do that. You've got 1,000 people in this room. Ask yourself, and I give them 5 seconds of background music, what's the number one problem in your business or in your personal life or in your relationship with your nearest and dearest that drives you nuts? And I give them 5 seconds to think about it. I say, you've got 1,000 people in this room. If you ask 20 people before you go home in 2 days' time, how do they handle that better, whether it's work-life balance or email overload or whatever it is? Ask 20 people in this room, you will go home with 5 awesome solutions. But we don't. We walk through life trying to kid ourselves and each other that, no, I got my stuff together. I don't need your advice. Thank you very much, pal. And it's just such a waste.
Interesting. Well, thank you for sharing that. If we could just wrap up, what are some maybe top 1, 2 or 3 tips you have for everyone on the politics of humour? How do we make it better in our everyday lives for us to be funnier and perhaps more resilient?
Sure. I guess it's the reason I titled my TED Talk this take funny seriously. Most of us walk through life and stumble across the funny and really enjoy it when it happens, rather than deliberately choosing to try and create more humor in our lives. Humor breaks down barriers in our personal life. Every night, with our kids, we ask our kids, what made you laugh at school today? And then we make deliberate attempts to create funny in our kids' lives and in our lives when we have dinner together. So do that. And because that feeling that I talked about when I was younger and I was sick at home, that feeling when everybody in the room is laughing at the same thing together. It just is, there's a magical effect that goes on in your brain when that happens. And all the social barriers come down. In business, I would say exactly the same thing. So like where our brains evolved to be in tribes of about 200 or less people. And so there's a few us in our brains and there's a lot of them. Most of the world, our brains separate into them. And if you're trying to connect with people, trying to influence people, they see you as a them, not an us. But if you can get them laughing, either at particularly at yourself or a shared frustration or common enemy. If you can get people laughing, one of those 3 things, all of a sudden those barriers come down and they see you as an us. Our brain gets flooded with these wonderful chemicals when you can make somebody laugh and you're both laughing at the same thing. Instantly, it's like instead of facing you and considering you a them, it's like you're arm in arm, arm around each other's shoulder, considering each other an us, looking at the same thing. So deliberately try to use humor in your business. So use humor in your personal life and use humor in your business. And don't wait for it to happen. Deliberately try to create humor. Again, I'll give you all the studies about, if you're in a leadership position at work and you can crack a joke, it enhances your perceived leadership skills. It builds credibility. It increases persuasion. It increases long-term memory retention. If you can wrap your message in humor, it increases long-term memory retention. It's such a powerful tool.
Oh, I've loved hearing that. Thank you so much for your time today. If you do want to connect further with Marty, there'll be some details on the show notes. You've been listening to the Politics of Everything. Until next time, keep well. Thanks for listening today. If you've enjoyed the Politics of Everything, we thrive on feedback. So please add a short review and share the podcast with your network and your friends and family. I'm also always on the hunt for fabulous new guests. So if you've got a view to share and an idea how to get our listeners excited, please email me at amber@bespokecomms, that's BESPOKECOMMS.com.au, and we'll be sure to get back to you. Until next time.